One of the most relevant parts of Bojack Horseman is its exploration of intergenerational trauma and how it can weave itself through an entire family's development. Hurt people hurt people. It's a phrase many of us have already heard, but the importance of this extremely simple expression is often understated in its effect on people growing up. Bojack as a television show vividly depicts, primarily through the main line of the Horseman family, how trauma can transfer from generation to generation, and how experiences that affect you as a person might not be something that you directly experience. All the way from the beginning of the show, we get an acute understanding of the environment that Bojack was brought up in, and how that has affected his general behavior, his addiction, and his ability to form meaningful relationships. But in later seasons, particularly season 4, we also get a glimpse at the events that shaped his parents, and even grandparents, to the point where we can see a clear cycle exhibited in the various generations of the Horseman/Sugarman family of passing on the trauma to children. But before we dive into the specifics of the show, what is intergenerational trauma in real life? This phenomenon was first studied and exhibited through descendants of survivors from the Holocaust, where those who have not directly experienced or been exposed to traumatic events have felt the effects and stress from those awful memories that their family members may harbor. In fact, upon psychiatric study of 3 patients in 1966, Vivian M. Rakoff remarked that the parents are not broken conspicuously, yet their children, all of whom were born after the Holocaust, display severe psychiatric symptomatology. It would almost be easier to believe that they, rather than their parents, had suffered the corrupting, searing hell. I have linked the article that all of this information is from in the description below. But as time has moved on, it has been researched in a more broad scope, including traumatic events that happen to individuals rather than entire ethnic groups. More recently, clinicians and researchers have recognized that individual traumas such as interpersonal violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, emotional abuse, neglect, or deprivation can also contribute to the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And many of these behaviors are extremely evident in the members of the Sugarman Horseman families, especially in Bojack himself. This show does an excellent job displaying the range of trauma and how such vastly different experiences can affect us all in such intricate and diverse ways. Those traumas that some can't access, can't recognize, can't remember, that are seemingly ingrained into you and can't be cleansed or understood, might be that way because they don't originate from your own experiences or memories. In the book, It Didn't Start With You, there's empirical evidence to reflect the fact that the prefrontal cortex has trouble contextualizing and verbalizing said traumatic memories, and it's extremely common to view these troubles as just parts of yourself, especially since you can't understand them, but still struggle to realize the root of where these anxieties come from, since they result from experiences that are not necessarily your own. It can be hard to truly understand and be aware of generational trauma, and I think that's why Bojack Horseman portraying it in such a vivid way is so vitally important for those who are still developing today. Now, there are multiple methods for how this can be transferred from generation to generation. Obviously, the parenting styles that developed from said experiences would have an effect on the children they're inflicted on, but there is also strong evidence that there is an epigenetic link between this transmission as well. Epigenetic meaning biologically heritable traits that can result from these traumatic experiences. These have been observed through DNA changes, hormonal disruptions, and other biological marks. Again, I've linked everything I have taken information from in the description below. Studies in the late 90s indicated that the experiences of one's parents might alter the regulation of stress-related pathways early in development, as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, which regulates stress, can be vulnerable to traumatic situations. That's right, I did my fucking research. And that parents who have dealt with PTSD, who have resultant low cortisol levels, which is a hormone that helps manage stress, pass those low levels on to their own children, especially if feelings of anxiety, anger, or fear are felt during pregnancy. According to Dr. Lipton, a researcher from Stanford University, the mother's emotions such as fear, anger, love, hope, among others, can biochemically alter the genetic expression of her offspring. But even besides epigenetics, and the hereditary aspect of passing on this trauma, the consequences that traumatic experiences have on our emotional state can affect how we behave and treat others. And for those with children, how they interact and manage their relationships directly contribute to the development of the child themselves. Again, in It Didn't Start With You, one of the first concepts touched on is traumatic reenactment, or repetition compulsion, as described by Sigmund Freud. This is essentially our brain's attempt of trying out the traumatic experience again to be able to overcome it, or get it right. This unconscious drive to relive past events could be one of the mechanisms at work when families repeat unresolved traumas in future generations, and is a large contributor to why this is such a prevalent cycle in many families. It's also stated that Carl Jung described our unconscious trauma as fate, destined to be experienced again through our own actions. So parents, having perhaps not fully dealt with their own traumas, end up repeating the same behavior, even if they still hold resentment for those who put them through those ordeals. Hence, this ending up as a cycle of treatment that can continuously be passed down through behavior as well as genetics. Our earliest view into this phenomenon in the show and the Horseman line is with Joseph and Honey Sugarman, who, by all accounts, were a positively happy and content couple for a solid amount of their adult lives, although Joseph was 1000% cheating for nearly their entire marriage. I don't know why people defend that guy. But when their oldest child died, Honey struggled to cope with the traumatic event, consistently feeling depressed and anxious, and because insight into psychology was absolute trash at that time, she was administered a lobotomy, essentially removing her ability to feel those emotions in any way, so that she wouldn't have to actually face or deal with that trauma, and Joseph wouldn't have to deal with it either. But the issue here is that her daughter is consistently present and listening, and after seeing her mother in such a regressed state, Beatrice learns that loving those close to you only results in heartache. And while it might not be something she'd overtly say out loud, it is definitely a primary reason why she was so unwilling to let anyone truly past her thick emotional walls for all of her life. I mean, Honey straight up asks her to promise not to love anyone, as she loved Cracker Jack right then and there. And Beatrice's treatment of Bojack throughout his childhood is exemplary of that. And while we do see some genuine affection for Butterscotch when they first meet, it's never really love, it's more just attraction. There wasn't any pushing past boundaries that was done that night that they hooked up. However, we never see any sort of affection displayed to Bojack, for reasons that I'll discuss more in just a little bit. She's essentially learned that the only consequence of unconditional love is tragedy and despair, and resolves not to offer that love to anyone in the future, basically ensuring she will instill this same type of behavior into the child she's raising. We also see how this affects Beatrice's perception of her brother, idolizing him, where Bojack in The View from Halfway Down,
the uncle I never met and yet could never live up to. Oh.
She used this caricature of a hero, which we also learn might not be exactly true in that same episode.
I actually never killed a Nazi. All my kills were friendly fire. I also never liberated any camps. I'm honestly not sure what I did.
To try and force Bojack into a mold that he would never quite fit, and thus left him feeling as though he never met her expectations. After all, from her point of view, he was the single thing holding her family together. After Cracker Jack's departure, it all went downhill. Just a small piece of the treatment derived from her childhood. Then we move into the later life of Beatrice, Bojack's mother, where it is abundantly clear the effect her upbringing has had on her emotional state and development as a person. The Beatrice we meet at the beginning of the series is cold, callous, and utterly cruel, to the point where the viewer questions her innate morality. She consistently scolds and berates Bojack in any flashback or scene that she's in, and makes no attempt to be maternal in any way. It's not until season 4 that we see the root causes of this type of behavior, and that she is ostensibly vicious and harsh due to traumatic experiences from her childhood. The ordeal with her mother always stayed with her as she grew into a young woman, and always played a major factor in her life-changing decisions. No matter where she went, on the back of her mind was that nagging feeling that she shouldn't let anyone get too close to her, lest she end up feeling the pain her mother felt. And we see that as a result, she never really looks for love for the beginning part of her life. While yes, I think the expectation Joseph puts on her to find a man in college is ridiculous, it is important to note her lack of desire to find a companion in her life at all. Not that that's really an issue if you don't want to do that. Her pushing Corbin Creamerman is exemplary of this when it's revealed later on that they might have actually been a good match if she had just given him a chance and not used extensive methods to keep him at arm's length. It does speak to the central idea her mother taught her about lovelessness, and her stalling to make any significant moves in her love life shows how she practices it as she grows into an adult. As I mentioned before, she's reliving her childhood in an attempt to get it right. She's going to trace the steps of her mother's journey, but without the extreme love that she felt for Crackerjack, expecting things to be different and better than they turned out back then. And even when she lets herself feel a little bit of affection, a little bit of love, she finds herself eventually disappointed and her mother being proven right, which only cements this cycle further. When she learns from Henrietta how Butterscotch uses the same shtick when picking up any woman, even when he first used it so long ago, you can see the last little bit of romance she clung to leave her mind entirely. That one small piece of herself that could even allow herself to love anyone is completely tainted by Butterscotch. Not to mention that it betrays what she was promised from what her mother and father taught her about marriage and fidelity. Because of a traumatic experience as a child, she felt obligated to keep Bojack from her night with Butterscotch, and thus felt that the child needed to be worth the sacrifice she made, since it, in her mind, wasn't really her choice. She states that she feels her life would have been better with Corbin Creamerman. The only reason she didn't choose to be with, and was directly prevented from it, was because of her pregnancy, aka Bojack Horseman himself. And when Henrietta finds herself in a similar situation, Beatrice pleads with her not to follow in her footsteps, showing her deep regret and dissatisfaction with her current life. This is the prime reason she always urged Bojack to engage in something vitally important, or why she criticized his acting work so heavily, even if it was obviously a success in general society's eyes. He couldn't just be a success. He had to be as big as Ibsen. Do something that changed the world or would have his name remembered for generations. Or, like her perfect brother, fight to protect the country and die for the cause. Anything else is not worthy of the sacrifice that she made. She also struggles a great deal with reliance on drugs and alcohol, a behavior that she likely also learned from her own mother, as just before the lobotomy, she got a very up-close look of some very unhealthy ways to deal and lessen the effects of trauma, even if it led to some extremely reckless behavior and almost got her killed. We can see that after the accident, young Beatrice doesn't really blame her mother either, showing that on some level she's beginning to understand and process what Honey is going through. And in her young adult years, she relies on medication to keep herself in line with traditional beauty standards of the time, even if she speaks rather progressively after her college education. Something that her mother also worked to teach her throughout her childhood, preventing her from eating any sweets or generally enjoying life. And then we move on to our main character, Bojack himself. There are many things about Bojack's personality that can be traced back to his upbringing or to events that have happened in his family's past. His cruelty and apathy, for one. One of the more obvious and frustrating aspects of Bojack's response to trauma is his inability to say "I love you" to anyone in his life. We see this exhibited several times over the course of the series, where he fundamentally cannot open himself up to be hurt or to love others due to the cruelty that was inflicted on him when he was just a child. This is the same behavior that Beatrice learned from her own mother, and it continues to be passed on down the Horseman line. That method of putting up harsh walls or pushing people away through negative behavior to avoid getting critically emotionally injured. It's such a common behavior for members of this family, and one that is bolstered by the casual cruelty that they inflict on each other every single day. Bojack needed those walls as a child to protect his own self-esteem, even if it did sink quite low by the time we meet him at the beginning of the series. Even Hollyhock, a character who Bojack feels clear affection for and pulled him out of an extremely dark place, is not enough to get him to say the words. That fear in him is so strong, so primal, that he can't really overcome it for most of the series. He does say to PC that he loves her once in The Best Thing That Ever Happened in Season 3, which is a prime example of him working past these boundaries that he set. It takes a lot of pushing on Princess Carolyn's part, that episode as well, to get him to come out and actually state his emotions. Additionally, a part of him internalizes that it was his fault, that they were mistreating him because he wasn't enough somehow, even if he always tried and wanted nothing more than to be enough for them. No matter how much he despises his parents and knows objectively that they were not good parents, there's a nagging feeling in him that he can't shake, that tells him he is terrible and that he does deserve it. His self-esteem was inadvertently affected by his parents' behavior after prolonged exposure to their mistreatment and neglect. It's almost impossible not to internalize all of that self-hate. Speaking of, Bojack also developed an internalized self-hatred of horses. Another result in Bojack's psyche from this cycle of trauma in his own family is a breakthrough we only really reach in season 6, and something that I personally hadn't really considered up until the point it was directly mentioned, where he fundamentally has stunted relationships with horses due to his negative upbringing around them. Even though I'm almost positive this was at first a creative choice to create a more diverse and cartoon main cast, none of Bojack's close personal friends are horses themselves, and even those he comes into contact with, he limits to other species, and no horse is spared either. He hates himself the most. Not only does he abhor his own behavior and personality, he began with a natural disdain for himself because of his tainted experience with his mother and father, who are invariably a part of him as well. Even Hollyhock, who he wants so badly to be close to, is kept at arm's length, as I mentioned previously, with his inability to say that he loves people. With her, there's another layer of this self-hatred for horses. Another aspect is his inability to allow himself to properly process and display his emotions. Ever notice how one of the most direct lessons Joseph tries to impart on Beatrice is that, quote, crying is stupid, and she later idolizes and admires her father, stating that he is the model for how men should act. So, when Bojack cries as a child after she forces him to smoke an entire cigarette, she leaves the exact same lesson with him, and he carries that with him for the rest of his life. In the shot, we directly address this issue, as Bojack is required to cry for a scene in the Secretariat movie, but states that he doesn't cry in front of other people, almost as if it's a strict rule that he's set for himself, something that he's simply not allowed to break. He is nearly incapable of opening himself up that far in front of other people, even if he's playing a character in a movie. I think this also must come partly from Butterscotch's side. Even though we don't learn much about his ancestry, it is worth mentioning that it isn't just from the trauma that we've explored. There is, I'm sure, much of Bojack's personality from Butterscotch's side of the family that we were probably going to explore given more time. Fuck you, Netflix. But he was originally a progressive, a member of the counterculture, until he was rejected. And because when he opened himself up and shared what he was proud of, he was criticized, he regressed harshly into a shell of misogyny and conservative repression. Expressing his emotions and actually engaging in his closest relationships became something that was womanly, or something that made him less of a man, because he's better than all those people that rejected him. So accurate, by the way. And while Bojack is definitely not an outward misogynist, though also definitely not a feminist, he definitely retains a lot of this repression. Again, from both sides of the family, and inadvertently treats women as if they're objects to satisfy his urges, just as his father did. Many times, he doesn't even know their names. He hates his father. He hates this behavior, and he hates himself, but he still repeats it. Even his substance abuse issues have roots in his familial ties. One of the most obvious examples of his learning this from his parents as they pass on their own trauma and methods for coping with it is in the premiere of season 6, where young Bojack finds his parents passed out after a party and himself, as a 4 to 6-year-old, drinks and lies with them in order to feel a connection that he never gets to feel. This coping mechanism was ingrained into him from the very beginning. One of the purposes of this episode is to show how present this issue has been in Bojack's life since always. It isn't something he learned as an adult. He wasn't corrupted by Hollywood. He derived this need from his home life and his parents. Not only this, but The biological component of traumatic stress that I mentioned can also lead to people running to these more easily accessed coping mechanisms, especially due to the clandestine nature of generational trauma. It's much, much harder to figure out what is going on inside of you, admit your problems, develop healthy coping mechanisms, and commit to bettering yourself every day than to turn to drink or drugs. And when that pain you feel is inaccessible and unexplainable, that barrier to entry is even higher. Not to mention that it's well known that alcoholism itself can be genetically passed on. But we can even move further than Bojack in how his experience affects Hollyhock, even after she has cut him out of her life, which we don't know is expressly permanent either. In A Quick One While He's Away, we see directly how Bojack's struggle with alcoholism and the alarming behavior she's witnessed through him has affected her perception of it, even though she has had no personally traumatic experiences with alcohol. She has a natural fear and apprehension from the stress she saw through Bojack while she was staying with him for those months during season 4. Not to mention that we never really hear Hollyhock's perspective on the whole Gina thing. Earlier in season 5, Bojack tries to assert that he understands the gravity of his addictions, and Hollyhock trusts him enough to return to school, but Hollyhock must have eventually been able to see past this incredibly fake interview and link the issue to his drug-fueled bender. I find it hard to believe that she missed the news of his subsequent injury and the situation on the Filbert set. Hollyhock's a smart girl. And all of these instances have severe psychological consequences for Hollyhock herself. Even if she wasn't there for those events, simply knowing of them can alter her processing when she's in similar situations, or those events that affected her parents, that is Butterscotch and Henrietta, can affect her without her knowing anything even about her own mother. And while this is definitely reaching, we never see Hollyhock around other horses either, really. Her friends are also all humans or other animals, and none of the positive figures in her life, her fathers, are horses either. After learning the extent of Bojack's transgressions, she might have begun to develop this same internalized self-hatred that Bojack did from his own parents, even though it wasn't addressed at all in the series. This is me just extrapolating. However, I will also say, and the show goes far to say, all of this does not mean that the cycle can't be broken. It's not irreparable, or something that you can't move on from. The importance, like a lot of episodes of Bojack try to say, is recognizing what the problem is. We see in Face of Depression that Bojack works to overcome the natural aversion to horses when he visits Old Horse Village in Connecticut, voluntarily surrounding himself and subsequently finding peace among this community of horses that he naturally feels an aversion to. And much of this work comes from his realization about that internalized self-hatred. He needed to recognize the issue before he could effectively work to overcome it. And as I said before, these feelings that come with generational trauma can often be unexplainable and confusing. The only way to be able to actually address it is by learning about your family's history and where the trauma actually comes from. Only then can you make the connection to what you are feeling and divide what is actually yours and what has been inherited. Hidden traumas might be revealed that you never even knew about, but still hold some level of control over your emotional state. I've mentioned it before, but if you struggle with anything that I've spoke about in this video, you really should read It Didn't Start With You. It's a really effective book. It even has written exercises for the readers to help work through their own specific anxieties, fears, and hangups. In this book, there's an entire section dedicated to how you can work through and cope with these traumas. Sometimes that can be through conversations, whether that be with a family member related to the inherited trauma, or if they've already passed on, with yourself in your own imagination. Don't knock it. It has honestly been proven to help. Other times it can be through creating soothing rituals or phrases, or keeping healing images around your environment. There's lots of methods for coping, and again, if you are looking for more, I suggest you read this book in greater detail. It's not even that long, and it's got a lot to say. But overall, recognizing the root causes of these harmful patterns that previous generations may have exhibited help to ensure that you don't repeat the same patterns in your own life, that you can hopefully do better next time because you recognize precisely what the issue was. I will say that the show also does not excuse any of these people from the culpability for their behavior, which is equally important in this conversation. There is an explanation for all of this negative and toxic behavior, these perpetual cycles, yes. Even a possibility that it is a part of our DNA. But it does not give anyone the right to mistreat others. Beatrice is not portrayed as some sort of hero after we learn the extent of what she's had to deal with in the past. She's still Beatrice, the same woman who we, as the audience, likely despise along with Bojack for her overt cruelty and terrible parenting. Same goes for Butterscotch. Free Churro is still completely filled with direct criticisms of their parenting style, horrifying negative anecdotes, and casual representations of their neglect. But even still, there's understanding in Bojack because of the trauma that they all share. He directly states that while they all hated each other, there was an understanding that their experience was shared, and it was something. Not enough, but something. And It Didn't Start With You, this is actually a part of the healing process described. Rejecting your parents, hating your parents, it's equal to hating or rejecting a part of yourself. Part of the path to healing is recognizing and understanding the pieces of you that are similar to your parents or guardians, and further exploring the effects of those traits on their and subsequently your behavior. You don't necessarily have to forgive them for everything, especially in cases like Bojack's parents, but you can certainly work to understand them, which leads to a reconciliation in its own right, which I fully believe Bojack does make some progress toward in Free Churro, even if neither of his parents are alive. He accepts his mother and resolves to see her as she is, not as the mother he always wanted her to be, mostly because he can't really hope for that mother anymore. As said in this book, our relationship with our parents is not dependent on what they do, how they are, or how they respond. It's about what we do. The change occurs in us. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I appreciate all of the support on YouTube. Like and subscribe, and continue the discussion in the comments if you enjoyed, or if you disagreed with anything that I said. If I have misrepresented anything that you've personally experienced, feel free to correct me. But I hope you did get something out of this video and hopefully understand a little bit more about how trauma can be passed from generation to generation, and especially how this is shown in Bojack Horseman as a show. I use this show to talk about these topics, really. But if you would like to support us further, go to patreon.com/PosiTVty to get early video essays that are also unedited. Also, you can vote on what you want to see on the channel, so it's a great way to get more content for yourself and support this channel and help it grow in the process. But I thank you for watching this video in the first place, and I hope you'll come back for another one.